The rain came down in sheets the night Ethan Carter's car disappeared. Thunder rolled across the empty highway as his black sedan skidded on the slick pavement, smashed through a guardrail, and plunged into the roaring river below. Rescue teams searched for 3 days. They dragged the freezing water, scanned every muddy bank, and sent divers deep into the current. But they found nothing, no body, no wreckage, no sign Ethan Carter had ever existed beyond the twisted tire marks left on the roadside. The town of Millbrook mourned him anyway, and his family. They moved on far too quickly. Diane Carter stood at the front of the church in a tailored black dress, dabbing perfectly dry eyes with an expensive silk handkerchief. Beside her, Richard Carter kept his head bowed, his expression carefully arranged into solemn grief. Lucas, Ethan's older brother, accepted sympathetic handshakes from neighbors while rehearsing his mournful nod in the reflection of the stained glass windows. To the people gathered there, they looked devastated, but behind closed doors they were celebrating. $425,000. Lucas whispered the night before the funeral as he raised a glass of whiskey. Richard smirked. Your brother was worth more dead than he ever was alive. Diane gave a sharp laugh. At least he finally contributed something to this family. The three clinked glasses together. Not one tear had been shed. Ethan had always been the black sheep of the Carter family, not because he'd failed, but because he refused to become like them. While Richard and Lucas chased shady business deals, and Diane obsessed over appearances, Ethan worked honestly as a structural engineer. He believed in earning what he had. His grandmother, Evelyn Carter, was the only one who ever understood him. She sees through people. Ethan once told a friend, especially my family, and Evelyn had seen plenty. Months before Ethan's accident, she'd quietly warned him, "Be careful, sweetheart." She'd said, her frail fingers gripping his hand tightly. Greed makes people dangerous, even family. At the time, Ethan had thought she was being dramatic. Now, drifting in and out of pain on a stranger's fishing boat, miles downstream, her words echoed in his mind. Because Ethan wasn't dead. When his car broke through the guardrail, he'd managed to kick free just before it sank into the river. Injured, half conscious, and carried by the current, he'd been pulled from the freezing water by Walter Briggs, an elderly fisherman who lived in a remote cabin nearly 40 miles away. Ethan had suffered a concussion, cracked ribs, and a shattered leg. For weeks he remained bedridden, too weak even to stand. Walter cared for him in silence, letting him recover while storms battered the cabin roof. The first time Ethan was strong enough to check the internet, he searched his own name and froze. Local engineer Ethan Carter, presumed dead after tragic accident. Below the headline was a photo of his funeral. An ornate mahogany coffin sat beneath white lilies. His mother stood dramatically over it, weeping for cameras. His brother looked crushed. His father accepted condolences with practiced sorrow. Ethan stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. Then he saw the second article. Carter family receives $425,000 life insurance pay. Out his blood ran cold. The comments beneath praised the family's strength, such heartbreaking loss, praying for the Carters. Ethan would be proud of how they're carrying on. His hands shook as realization hit. They hadn't even waited. No body had been recovered. No proof existed that he was dead. Yet somehow they had rushed through the paperwork, held his funeral, and collected his insurance. Walter noticed Ethan's pale face. Bad news. Ethan swallowed hard. My family buried an empty coffin and got rich doing it. The old fisherman studied him for a long moment. What are you going to do? At first, Ethan wanted to march straight back to Millbrook and expose them. But fate had other plans. 2 days later, another headline appeared. Beloved Millbrook philanthropist Evelyn Carter passes away at 84. Ethan's chest tightened. Grandma was gone. Then he read further. Her will would be read publicly in 1 week. And suddenly, something clicked. Grandma had always known what kind of people Richard, Diane, and Lucas truly were. If she had left behind one final plan, Ethan intended to be there to see it unfold. For the first time since learning of his family's betrayal, Ethan smiled. They thought they'd buried him. They had no idea the dead man was coming back. The morning Ethan learned of his grandmother's death, the world felt unnaturally still. Outside Walter Briggs' cabin, the river drifted calmly beneath a gray sky, as if it hadn't nearly claimed his life only weeks earlier. Ethan sat by the small wooden table, staring at the glowing screen of Walter's old laptop. The headline about Evelyn Carter's passing blurred through his tears. Grandma Evelyn had been more than family. She had been his anchor, the one person who had loved him without condition. While Richard and Diane measured affection in money and appearances, Evelyn had given Ethan something real, belief. When Ethan was 10 and came home crying after Lucas mocked him for wanting to design bridges instead of joining the family business, it was Grandma who sat beside him on the porch swing. "Never let people shame you for building instead of taking," she'd told him. Creators always outlast destroyers. He had carried those words through every difficult year. Now she was gone. Ethan leaned back, grief washing over him. But beneath the sadness, another feeling was rising. Curiosity. Grandma Evelyn had never trusted the rest of the Carter family. She had inherited the Carter estate after Ethan's grandfather passed, a sprawling property worth millions, along with investment accounts, commercial properties, and family trusts that had been carefully protected for decades. Richard had spent years trying to pressure her into signing everything over. She never did. "Your father sees inheritance as entitlement," she once told Ethan, but wealth without character destroys people. At the time, Ethan thought she was simply being cautious. Now he wondered if she had known something far worse. That evening, Walter handed Ethan a cup of tea and sat across from him. "You look like a man solving a puzzle." Ethan exhaled. "My grandmother was too smart to leave things simple." "What do you mean?" "She knew my family. She knew how greedy they were." Walter raised an eyebrow and Ethan's eyes narrowed as memory surfaced. 3 months before his accident, he had visited Evelyn at her estate. She had been unusually serious that day, leading him into her study and locking the door behind them. "I've updated my will," she had said. Ethan had laughed nervously. "Grandma, don't talk like that. I'm 84, dear. I've earned the right." Then her voice lowered. "There's a clause in it, one that depends on you." He frowned. "Me?" She smiled faintly. "Someday it may protect what matters most." When he'd asked what she meant, she simply changed the subject. Now, sitting in Walter's cabin, Ethan finally understood. Grandma had prepared for something, and if her will involved him, then the public reading was no accident. Back in Millbrook, the Carter family was already celebrating. Richard paced through the marble foyer of Evelyn's mansion, grinning as he spoke on the phone. "Once the estate transfers, we'll finalize the resort investment." Lucas lounged on the leather sofa, scrolling through luxury car listings. "I'm thinking Italian this time." Diane stood before the mirror, adjusting her pearls. "Honestly, after all these years, Evelyn owes us." Not one of them mentioned Ethan. To them he was gone, disposed of. A useful tragedy that had delivered $425,000 and removed the one obstacle standing between them and Grandma's fortune. What they didn't know was that Evelyn's attorney, Martin Hale, had called for all beneficiaries to attend in person for the reading. And hidden inside the sealed will was a final condition, one Evelyn had crafted after privately hiring an investigator to look into the suspicious speed of Ethan's death declaration. The investigator had uncovered irregularities, pressured signatures, accelerated insurance filings, and communications between Richard and the insurance adjuster before the official search had even ended. Evelyn had seen enough, so she amended her will. The clause was devastatingly simple. If Ethan Carter is confirmed deceased, the estate will be divided equally among Richard, Diane, and Lucas. However, if Ethan Carter is found alive, or if reasonable doubt exists concerning his death, the entire Carter estate shall transfer solely to Ethan Carter. It was her final trap, and Ethan was about to spring it. The next morning, Walter drove him to Millbrook. As the familiar town appeared on the horizon, Ethan adjusted the dark coat that concealed the scars still healing beneath. His pulse quickened. For weeks, his family had lived richly on the profits of his death. They had toasted over his empty coffin, smiled for cameras, collected blood money, but tomorrow, at Grandma Evelyn's will reading, they would face the one thing they never expected. The man they had already buried. Ethan stared out the windshield at the Carter estate rising in the distance. For the first time since the accident, he felt completely alive, and he was ready to walk back into the world of the living. The Carter estate had never felt colder. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Grandma Evelyn's law office as Richard, Diane, and Lucas sat around the polished mahogany conference table. The room smelled of leather, bound books, and expensive cologne, but beneath the polished surface hung a tension thick enough to choke on. At precisely 10 o'clock, Attorney Martin Hale entered carrying a sealed navy blue folder. He adjusted his glasses and gave the family a measured nod. "Thank you all for attending. As requested by Mrs. Evelyn Carter, her will shall be read in person before all beneficiaries." Diane folded her hands dramatically and sighed. Such a heartbreaking day. Lucas glanced at his phone beneath the table, already calculating how quickly his share of the inheritance could be liquidated. Richard sat tall, trying to appear solemn, though the faint twitch of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. To them, this was not a funeral. It was payday. Martin broke the wax seal and unfolded the first page. Before the distribution of assets, Mrs. Carter included a personal statement. He cleared his throat and began reading. "To my family, wealth reveals character. It magnifies who we truly are. Some use it to build, others use it to consume. Today, my final wish is that what I built goes only to the one person who valued people over possessions." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Diane frowned. Lucas rolled his eyes. Martin continued. "The Carter estate, including all financial accounts, investment holdings, and the Millbrook property, shall be distributed according to the following condition." Now the room sharpened with attention. Richard leaned forward. "This condition concerns my grandson, Ethan Carter." At the sound of Ethan's name, Diane stiffened. Martin read carefully. "If Ethan Carter is verifiably deceased, the estate shall be divided equally among Richard Carter, Diane Carter, and Lucas Carter." A slow smile spread across Richard's face. Diane exhaled with relief. Lucas smirked and whispered, "There it is." But Martin wasn't finished, however. The single word cut through the room like a blade. "If Ethan Carter is alive, or if any doubt exists regarding his death, the entirety of my estate shall transfer immediately and exclusively to Ethan Carter." Silence. Then Richard let out a short laugh. "Well, that's irrelevant." Diane nodded quickly. "Ethan's dead." Martin looked up from the page. "Actually, before proceeding, I am legally required to verify his status." Richard's smile faltered. "What does that mean?" Before Martin could answer, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the office creaked open. Every head turned. A tall figure stepped inside, dressed in a charcoal coat, his face thinner than before, faint scars tracing one side of his jaw. For one impossible second, no one breathed. Diane's hand flew to her throat. Lucas stumbled backward so violently his chair crashed to the floor. Richard turned ghostly pale. Ethan Carter stood in the doorway, very much alive. No need to verify. Ethan said calmly. His voice was steady, though his heart thundered in his chest. "I'm here." Diane screamed. The sharp sound shattered the stunned silence. "That's impossible." Lucas stared as if he'd seen an actual ghost. Richard gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. Martin Hale simply removed his glasses and nodded. "Mr. Carter, thank you for arriving." Ethan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on his family. He saw panic bloom across their faces, and for the first time in his life they looked afraid of him. "You buried an empty coffin," he said. No one answered. "You held my funeral, smiled for cameras, collected $425,000 before the search was even officially closed." Diane's lips trembled. You thought I was useful dead." Richard finally found his voice. "Ethan, listen." "No." The single word stopped him cold. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside are copies of the insurance claim, the accelerated filing requests, and email correspondence proving you pushed for payment before my death was confirmed. Martin accepted the envelope without surprise. Richard's face drained of all color. "You gave that to him." "I gave copies to the insurance fraud division this morning." The room erupted. "You traitor," Lucas shouted. Diane burst into tears. Richard lunged halfway to his feet before freezing as Martin raised a hand. "There is no dispute to be made," the attorney said firmly. He lifted the will. "Under Evelyn Carter's legally binding terms, Ethan Carter is alive. Therefore, the full Carter estate transfers to him immediately." The words hit like thunder. Diane collapsed into her chair. Lucas muttered curses under his breath. Richard stared at Ethan with naked disbelief. Everything they had schemed for was gone. Ethan met their stunned faces with quiet resolve. Grandma Evelyn had known exactly what she was doing, and as he stood in the office they thought would make them rich. Ethan realized the sweetest revenge wasn't anger. It was watching greed destroy itself. The silence in Martin Hale's office felt heavier than stone. For several long seconds, no one moved. Richard Carter stood frozen beside the conference table, his face drained of all color. Diane's mascaras. Streaked tears had smeared down her cheeks, ruining the carefully polished image she had spent years protecting. Lucas stared at Ethan with pure disbelief, his hands trembling as if reality itself had betrayed him. Everything they had counted on was gone. The mansion, the investments, the land, the future they had already spent in their minds. All of it now belonged to the son and brother they had declared dead. Ethan stood still, his expression calm. He had imagined this moment countless times during his recovery in Walter's cabin. He had imagined rage, screaming accusations, but standing there now, he felt none of those things, only clarity. Richard was the first to break. "This is absurd," he barked, slamming both palms against the polished table. "There has to be some legal challenge, some loophole." Martin Hale adjusted his glasses. "There is none. Mrs. Carter's will is airtight. The estate transfers immediately." Diane stumbled toward Ethan, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, we were grieving. We thought you were gone." Ethan looked at her without emotion. "Did grief make you cash the insurance check 2 days after my funeral?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Lucas stepped forward, anger replacing fear. "You think you've won. You got lucky." Ethan's eyes met his brother's. "No, Lucas. Grandma made sure justice showed up." At that exact moment, a knock echoed through the office. The door opened. Two sharply dressed investigators stepped inside, badges visible. Richard's face went pale. "Mr. Richard Carter," one of them said evenly. "We're with the State Insurance Fraud Division. We need to ask you, Diane Carter and Lucas Carter, several questions regarding the life insurance claim filed under Ethan Carter's presumed death." The room exploded. Diane gasped and nearly collapsed. Lucas cursed loudly. Richard attempted to protest, but his voice cracked under pressure. As the investigators escorted them out one by one, Richard turned back toward Ethan. "This is your family." Ethan's answer came cold and steady. "No, family doesn't bury people for profit." The door closed behind them. And just like that, the Carter dynasty fell apart. The weeks that followed changed Millbrook forever. News of the fraudulent funeral spread quickly. The same town that had once offered sympathy to the Carter family now recoiled in disgust. Richard and Lucas were formally charged with insurance fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying legal declarations. Diane, though avoiding prison through cooperation, became a social outcast. The Carter name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, became a symbol of greed. But Ethan refused to let his grandmother's legacy be defined by scandal. Standing on the front steps of the estate one bright spring morning, he looked over the sprawling grounds Evelyn had spent her life protecting. And he made a decision. 6 months later, the old Carter mansion reopened as the Evelyn Carter Community Foundation. The East Wing became a scholarship center for local students pursuing engineering, medicine, and education. The gardens were transformed into public spaces for families. The library became a youth learning center filled with books, computers, and tutoring programs. Above the entrance, a bronze plaque carried Evelyn's favorite words, "Build what outlasts you." Walter Briggs stood beside Ethan at the opening ceremony. She'd be proud. The old fisherman said quietly. Ethan smiled. "I hope so." That afternoon, after the crowd had gone, Ethan walked alone to the cemetery on the hill overlooking Millbrook. He stopped at Grandma Evelyn's grave, placing a single white rose against the polished stone. For a moment, he simply stood there. The wind rustled softly through the trees. "Thank you," he whispered, "not just for the inheritance. Not for the trap she had set, but for believing in him when no one else had." Behind him, footsteps approached. He turned to find Richard, Diane, and Lucas standing at the cemetery gate. They looked smaller somehow, stripped of power, pride, and illusion. Richard stepped forward cautiously. "We made mistakes." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Please help us." Lucas said nothing. Ethan studied them for a long moment. Then he spoke calmly. "You buried me for money." His voice was quiet, but every word landed with finality. "Grandma made sure greed would be the thing that buried you." He turned away without another word. As he walked down the hill toward the future waiting below, sunlight broke through the clouds. For the first time in years, Ethan felt free. They had tried to erase him. Instead, he had returned stronger. Not as the man they buried, but as the man who had finally risen.